It was their fatal assumption that she was merely another unassuming young black girl, someone who lacked a protector. Acting on this chilling miscalculation, they dragged her into the shadows of the woodland behind Jefferson High and left her suspended from a branch, treating a heinous act as a mere diversion. In their warped reality, cruelty was synonymous with status, and terror was their chosen sport. Yet, they overlooked a catastrophic detail. Her father is no ordinary man. He is Marcus Carter, the Black Hammer, a peerless boxing icon, whose hands have dismantled legacies and whose fury brook no apology. The moment he discovered the abrasive scars of the noose upon his daughter's neck, the nightmare for those responsible truly commenced. The transition from the formidable, protective shadow of a legendary father to the uncompromising reality of a new educational institution is never a simple undertaking. For Maya Carter, the atmosphere at Jefferson High suggested something far more sinister than standard teenage angst. As she crossed the threshold of the campus for the first time, she carried not only the physical weight of her satchel, but the silent, heavy legacy of Marcus Carter, a name that commanded absolute respect in the boxing ring, but offered precious little shelter in the predatory hallways of a suburban secondary school. The morning wind was considerably sharper than the forecast had suggested. It sliced across the open campus like an invisible, whetted blade, tugging at her backpack straps and brushing cold, spectral fingers over the nape of her neck. Students spilled out of the main oak doors in boisterous waves, their laughter and shouts echoing off the brickwork as they threw jackets over their shoulders. Yet, the moment Maya entered the shared space, everything inside her stilled. Whilst the ambient noise remained at a constant roar, the air immediately surrounding her shifted in density, as though an unseen hand had turned down the thermostat without ever touching the dial. Eyes were fixed upon her instantly. These were not the fleeting, curious glances of typical teenagers. They were eyes that scanned, assessed, and judged with a clinical coldness. She had experienced this specific brand of scrutiny before in her previous neighborhood, but the version manifest at Jefferson High felt significantly heavier, as though it carried a dark, unspoken history she did not yet possess the keys to understand. She took one more tentative step into the courtyard, her boots crunching softly on the pavement. That was when she first noticed them, the self-appointed gatekeepers of this hierarchy. A cluster of tall, physically imposing boys in vibrant orange varsity jackets stood near the chain-link fence by the baseball diamond. The jackets themselves, stark and neon against the morning gray, made them impossible to disregard. But it was their collective posture that caused her pulse to spike. They stood with arms crossed and smirks pressed lazily onto their lips, their heads tilted in unison like apex predators observing a new, unproven prey. One of them nudged his companion with an elbow, the trio staring directly at her as if she had committed a grave trespass simply by existing. Maya forced herself to look away, fixing her gaze on the distant entrance. She told herself that she simply needed to survive the first day, to blend into the background, to breathe, and to navigate the bureaucracy of her new schedule. It should have been a straightforward task. "Hey there." A cheerful, booming voice suddenly fractured her internal monologue. Coach Harris, a man built like a monolith with broad shoulders and a whistle dancing against his chest, approached her with a wide smile. "You must be our new transfer student," he said, offering a calloused hand. "Maya Carter, am I right?" "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice small but steady. "Welcome to Jefferson High. If you find yourself in need of assistance, whether it be directions or schedule conflicts, do not hesitate to seek me out." His smile wavered almost imperceptibly as he glanced over Maya's shoulder toward the boys by the fence. His voice dropped an octave, and his eyes narrowed with a sudden, grave intensity. "And, well, a bit of friendly advice for a newcomer. Be exceptionally careful around the orange jackets." Maya blinked, a knot of apprehension tightening in her chest. "Who are they, exactly?" He hesitated, a fleeting shadow of discomfort crossing his face. "Let us just say they do not take kindly to outsiders. They view this school as their personal fiefdom." Before she could press him for more information, A violent, percussive crack split through the air. A baseball shot through the atmosphere like a projectile, missing Maya's temple by barely an inch before slamming into the metal slats of the bench directly behind her. The sound echoed metallic, violent, and utterly intentional. Her breath hitched in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Raucous laughter erupted from the fence line. The boys in the orange jackets were doubled over, clapping and howling with a derisive energy. Stunning reflexes, one of them bellowed. "Welcome to the jungle, sweetheart." Coach Harris spun around on his heel, fury tightening the line of his jaw. "Cut it out, Blake," he barked. The tallest of the group, Blake Henderson, raised his hands in a mock gesture of innocence whilst maintaining a chilling, predatory grin. "Relax, Coach. I am simply practicing my aim." Maya's palms grew cold. She did not utter a single word. She found she lacked the capacity to do so. She kept walking, her pace quickening. But the courtyard was not yet finished with her. As she passed the bike racks, a girl with short, tightly curled hair and a hoodie pulled low over her brow brushed past her. The girl did not stop walking, nor did she look back, but she leaned in just close enough for Maya to feel the warmth of her breath against her ear. "If I were you," the girl whispered, "I would not linger in this courtyard for a second longer than necessary." Maya froze in her tracks. "What did you?" But the girl was already gone, swallowed by the dense crowd. A chill ran down Maya's spine that was far more frigid than the autumn wind. Jefferson High was fundamentally wrong. It was not merely an unfriendly environment, it was malignant. Somewhere deep within the recesses of her mind, a small, instinctive voice whispered a single, urgent command: "Run." The transition from the exposed, hostile courtyard to the claustrophobic hallways offered absolutely no respite. If anything, it merely served to intensify the profound sense of isolation that had begun to consume Maya's morning. As she navigated the labyrinthine corridors, she felt the eyes of the student body acting like a physical weight against her shoulders. The morning hallway of Jefferson High was a battlefield, disguised as a mere school corridor. Lockers were slammed with unnecessary violence, sounding like small explosions. Sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum with an irritating, high-pitched rhythm. Somewhere nearby, a portable speaker blasted a distorted rap beat that bounced off the cinder-block walls, creating a disorienting acoustic environment. Students moved in a restless, surging tide, laughing, shouting, and shoving, yet somehow they parted just slightly as Maya approached. As if she carried an invisible warning label, she clutched her schedule so tightly the paper began to crinkle, taking slow, deliberate breaths to steady her nerves. "Just reach the classroom," she commanded herself. "Do not let them see the fear. Do not look lost." However, malice has a peculiar way of sniffing out its favorite target with unerring accuracy. As she rounded a sharp corner, her shoulder collided with something remarkably solid, not a person, but a physical obstacle with the density of a moving brick wall. The impact was jarring, sending shockwaves through her frame and causing her books to fly from her grasp, smacking against the floor with a hollow thud. A few audible gasps rose from the surrounding students. A wide circle of space formed almost instantly, as though the other students possessed a sixth sense that warned them not to stand too close to what was about to transpire. Maya blinked, her vision momentarily swimming. Then, she looked up. Blake Henderson stood before her, looming like a dark monument. At this close range, he was far more intimidating than the rumors suggested. Tall, broad-chested, and radiating a brand of effortlessly cruel confidence. He wore the kind of smirk that belonged to someone who had never been told no in his entire existence. His orange varsity jacket seemed to glow obnoxiously under the flickering fluorescent lights. Owen and Troy, his ever-present lieutenants, flanked him on either side, each wearing matching grins that remained chillingly distant from their eyes. Well, Blake drawled, his voice a smooth, affected baritone as he folded his muscular arms. "If it isn't our new little tourist, lost in the woods. Maya felt a flush of indignant heat crawl up her neck. "You ran into me," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Blake chuckled a dry, mirthless sound and leaned forward, peering at her as if he were analyzing a specimen under a microscope. "Thoroughly relax, sweetheart. I simply desired a superior vantage point to inspect the new transfer. I must say, your skin tone really pops under this specific lighting. Doesn't it, boys?" A mobile phone was hoisted somewhere in the periphery of the crowd. Someone whispered in a hushed, excited tone, "He is live-streaming this right now." Maya's stomach twisted into a cold knot. She bent down to gather her scattered books, desperate for this public spectacle to reach its conclusion, but Blake's heavy sneaker suddenly shot forward. He kicked her notebook with casual precision, sending it skidding across the linoleum and under a distant row of lockers. Derisive laughter erupted from the spectators. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with mock contrition. "Terribly clumsy of me." Owen clapped his hands together like a trained seal. "Classic move, Blake. Absolutely classic." Troy pulled out his own device. The lens focused squarely on Maya's face. "Give the fans a quote, Blake. Tell them how we welcome the outsiders." Maya stood up slowly, her jaw set with a grim finality, her eyes remaining steady and unblinking. She refused to grant him the satisfaction of tears. She refused to exhibit fear, certainly not in front of a hallway populated by people who were already betting on her eventual collapse. "Pick up your book," Blake ordered, the playful lilt in his voice replaced by a cold, sharp edge of command. "No," she replied quietly. The laughter died in an instant. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. Blake tilted his head to the side, looking like a cat studying a mouse that had suddenly dared to squeak in defiance. He stepped in close, far too close, until she was enveloped by his physical presence, and could smell the sickly sweet scent of peppermint gum on his breath. Then, in a whisper so low it was intended for her ears alone, he murmured, "We are fully aware of who your father is, Maya. We know exactly what he does for a living. And trust me, sweetheart, a people of his particular pedigree do not tend to last very long in a place like this." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, but confusion was beginning to hit harder than the fear. Her father? What on earth did they think they knew? Her father was a quiet, intensely private man. He was a hard-working legend who had retired to a life of peace. He was not someone who would ever cross paths with boys of Blake's ilk. She took a deliberate step back, breaking his orbit. "You do not know the first thing about my father," Blake laughed, a loud, booming sound that was intended for the entire hallway to hear. "Of course, Maya. Keep telling yourself that if it helps you sleep at night." But the chill that cascaded down Maya's spine did not originate from the sound of his voice. It came from the sudden, sickening realization that someone, somewhere, had deliberately fed these boys a calculated lie regarding her family, and lies of that magnitude rarely originated from harmless or accidental places. Students began to murmur amongst themselves as the tension reached a plateau. Blake blew her a sarcastic, mocking kiss before turning on his heel. His sycophants echoed the gesture with theatrical bows. As they sauntered off, Owen yelled back, "Welcome to the real world, new girl. Do try not to cry too vociferously." Jefferson High did not merely possess bullies. It possessed a systemic plan. Maya tightened her grip on her remaining books until her knuckles turned white. Someone had disseminated a false narrative about her father, and she intended to uncover exactly who was responsible. The cruelty manifest in the hallway soon underwent a disturbing evolution, shifting from physical intimidation into a digital assault that transformed the school's communal space into a theater of public humiliation. The cafeteria at Jefferson High was a sprawling, chaotic living organism, loud, overcrowded, and pulsing with far too many voices and an insufficient amount of air. Plastic trays clattered incessantly, metal chairs scraped against the floor with a screeching dissonance. The heavy, greasy scent of pizza, chips, and something vaguely charred drifted through the atmosphere. Students swarmed every available table, talking over one another, filming social media challenges, and laughing with an artificial, performative loudness. To a casual observer, it was the standard chaos of a lunch break. To Maya, it was a tactical minefield. She moved with a ghost-like quietness through the mayhem, clutching her tray and searching for a remote seat where she might effectively vanish. Every table she passed seemed to fall into a momentary, pointed silence for a heartbeat, just long enough for her to feel the crushing weight of their collective gaze before the cacophony resumed behind her. She eventually settled at a small, isolated table near the far wall, furthest from the exit. She had barely taken her first bite when a raucous shout erupted near the front of the hall. "Yo! Volume up! Put it on the main display!" Maya stiffened, her fork hovering in midair. The cafeteria's primary projection screen, usually reserved for mundane school announcements or sporting highlights, suddenly flickered into life. The sound system crackled with static before the volume was cranked to a distorted maximum. Students began a rhythmic, tribal chanting, "Play it, play it, play it." Then, the video commenced. At first, Maya's brain struggled to process the imagery. It was her face, unmistakably, but it had been digitally manipulated, twisted, stretched, and filtered into something grotesque and unrecognizable. Her eyes were enlarged to cartoonish proportions. Her mouth was distorted. A crude monkey filter had been superimposed over her features. The accompanying audio was a fast-paced, mocking track of tribal drums. Her stomach dropped into a bottomless pit of shame. The caption flashing across the bottom of the screen in bold, neon letters read, "New. Import at Jefferson High." Uproarious laughter exploded across the room like a physical shockwave. Students were slapping the tables, wheezing with laughter, and pointing unabashedly at the screen. Hundreds of phones were produced instantly, the students filming not just the screen, but the crowd's ecstatic reaction to the humiliation. Maya felt her chest constrict, her lungs refusing to take in the stale air. "Bro, this is pure gold," someone shouted. "Who produced this? Blake, you are a genius." And there he sat. Blake Henderson was leaning back in his chair like a king presiding over a court of jesters. Owen and Troy were beside him, high-fiving anyone who approached. Remarkably, Blake did not even look at the screen. His eyes were fixed solely on Maya. He smirked, the expression clear and triumphant. This entire production had been staged for an audience of one. Maya stared down at her table, her vision blurring as she blinked rapidly, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over and grant them their final victory. The room felt as though it were shrinking, the noise becoming an unbearable roar. Her ears rang, her throat burned. She wanted nothing more than to dissolve into the floorboards. But before she could break, something entirely unexpected occurred. A chair screeched violently against the floor. Someone stood up. "Enough!" A voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. Heads turned in a slow, confused pivot. Elena Thompson, a tall, sharp-featured girl wearing a denim jacket adorned with political pins, marched directly toward Blake's table. Her hands were trembling with indignation, but her voice remained remarkably steady. "What is fundamentally wrong with you?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "This is not comedy. You are publicly humiliating a peer in front of the entire school. It is pathetic." A ripple of genuine shock traversed the cafeteria. Blake raised his groomed eyebrows in mock surprise. "Thoroughly relax, Elena. We are merely engaging in a bit of light-hearted fun. It is a joke." "This is overtly racist," Elena snapped back, her eyes flashing with fire. "Do you honestly believe that tormenting a new student is a valid form of entertainment? It is disgusting." Blake tilted his head, his smirk sharpening into something more dangerous. "It is fascinating that you should adopt such a moral high ground, Elena, especially considering your own history." Blake pulled out his phone with a flourish. He tapped the screen, and a moment later, the main projector synced with his device. A screenshot illuminated the screen, a private text thread from Elena, dated months ago. It read, I cannot stand girls like her, always acting tough and entitled." The room gasped. Elena went deathly pale, her mouth hanging open. "That is— Blake, you have edited that. I never sent that. It is a forgery." "Oh, come now." Blake cut in with a laugh. "Do not attempt to play the innocent saint now that the spotlight is on you." Students began to whisper, their allegiance shifting in a heartbeat. Some looked at Elena with newfound disgust. Others began filming her as if she were the true villain of the piece. The only individual who had dared to defend Maya had just been systematically dismantled in front of everyone. Elena's voice cracked. "You are lying. You are a liar." Blake merely shrugged, the image of casual indifference. "Believe whatever you wish. The digital receipts do not lie." Owen chimed in with a cruel grin. "I suppose you and Monkey Girl have more in common than we initially thought." The laughter erupted once more, crueler than before. Maya felt something inside her soul break, not because of the video, but because she had watched the only person who tried to help her get annihilated for the effort. Elena looked at Maya with eyes full of apology and unshed tears before she stumbled backward and fled the cafeteria in a deafening silence. Blake leaned back, thoroughly satisfied with the outcome. When the only person who defends you is destroyed, you learn a lesson with remarkable speed. You are utterly on your own. Maya realized then that the B Squad was not merely a group of bullies. They were strategic, they were resourced, and they were willing to incinerate anyone who dared to stand in their way. Seeking justice from the institutions designed to protect students proved to be another calculated snare in Blake's elaborate game. As Maya walked towards the administrative wing, the air felt thick and heavy, every step requiring a monumental effort of will. The assistant principal's office was a claustrophobic space that reeked of ancient carpet and stale coffee. Assistant Principal Walker looked up from his monitor with a polite, entirely performative smile. "Maya Carter," he greeted, folding his manicured hands. "Please, do take a seat." Maya sat, her fingers white as she gripped her backpack straps to prevent them from shaking. Walker leaned back, his voice oily and soft. "Coach Harris mentioned you have had a, shall we say, challenging morning? I need to report something serious," Maya began, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Blake Henderson and his associates produced a racist video targeting me and broadcast it to the entire cafeteria." Walker's expression remained perfectly neutral. "I see. And do you happen to possess a copy of this video?" No. I did not record it. I was the target." "Well," Walker said with a tone of gentle condescension, "it is exceedingly difficult to take action without empirical evidence. It becomes a matter of hearsay, and we must be fair to all students." "But hundreds of students saw it," Maya insisted, her voice rising in desperation. "Dozens of phones were out. Surely someone can verify. And did any of these witnesses come forward?" Walker interrupted, his tone sharpening. He let out a weary sigh. "Maya, relocating to a new school is stressful. We must be careful not to misinterpret normal teenage behavior. Perhaps you are being overly sensitive due to your past experiences." Maya was stunned. He was gaslighting her, systematically dismantling her reality. "That was not normal," she whispered. "They humiliated me. They targeted my race." "I am sure it felt that way," Walker replied smoothly. "But occasionally emotions exaggerate events that were never intended to be harmful. Besides, Blake Henderson originates from a family that supports this school quite generously. We must be mindful of reputational misunderstandings." There it was, the ugly truth. Walker was not a facilitator of justice. He was an insurance policy for the privileged. Maya stood up abruptly. "So, you are going to do nothing? Bring me evidence, Maya. Until then, try to avoid conflict. And try not to take these social frictions so personally." Her pulse hammered with rage, but she said nothing. She walked out of the office, but as the door clicked shut, she paused to peer through the glass slit. Blake was standing in the office now, looking entirely relaxed. Walker extended his hand, and they shook with the easy familiarity of long-time allies. Maya felt a wave of ice-water cold spread through her being. The system was not neutral. It was rigged. When the adults in power choose the predator, the prey has nowhere left to turn. She finally understood. She wasn't just fighting bullies. She was fighting a power structure designed to protect them at all costs. The harrowing day did not end with the school bell. Instead, it offered a chilling reminder that the harassment had breached the school walls and followed Maya into the world outside. The sun was bleeding into the horizon in a bruised, violet hue when Maya stepped towards the rear car park. The sky glowed a deep orange, casting long, warped shadows that looked like reaching fingers. From the second she pushed open the heavy fire door, she felt watched. Her backpack felt 10 times heavier. Every footstep echoed with an unnatural loudness, and then she heard it. Crunch. A deliberate footstep, far too close behind her. She spun around instantly, heart leaping into her throat. There was nothing, only rows of silent cars and the wind whistling through skeletal branches. She tried to steady her breathing. "You are merely imagining it," she told herself. She turned back and continued walking. Crunch. Another step, precisely timed to follow her own. Maya tightened her grip on her straps. This was no longer a figment of her imagination. It was a hunt. Crunch. Soft. Persistent. She spun around a second time, scanning the dying amber light. Still nothing. The car park felt like a ghost town. She reached her old sedan, the sanctuary her father had helped her rebuild, and noticed something stark white tucked under her windscreen wiper. Her hands shook as she pulled the folded paper free. It contained 3 words in aggressive black ink. "Leave. Before it is too late." The world seemed to tilt. Her throat tightened as if an invisible hand were squeezing it shut. They knew where she parked. They were watching her leave. She crumpled the note, climbed into her car, and locked the doors with a frantic click. What she did not see was the figure concealed behind an ancient maple tree. Blake Henderson was there, his phone raised, recording her terror. "Damn, look at her. She is absolutely terrified," he whispered, a predatory grin spreading across his face. Owen snickered beside him. "Send that to the group chat. She is going to break at any second." They remained perfectly still, allowing the psychological weight of fear to do its work. However, they were not the only observers. 10 yards away, behind a rusted bike rack, Elena Thompson watched everything. She had followed Maya to apologize but stumbled onto this ambush instead. Elena took a clear, high-resolution photo of Blake and Owen. Her thumb hovered over the send button, but fear stopped her. She remembered how easily Blake had destroyed her in the cafeteria. If she stood up for Maya, she would be next. She didn't send it. Not yet. But she saved it, a small insurance policy against the darkness. From her hiding spot, Elena watched Maya's car pull away, the red taillights fading into the dusk. The car park fell silent. Blake lowered his phone, smirking. "She is almost ready to crack. Tomorrow morning will be the finale." Maya drove home with her mind unraveling, unaware that the most harrowing night of her life was waiting just around the corner. The skeletal trees behind Jefferson High stood as silent witnesses in the failing light, their thin branches casting warped shadows as the sky bled from orange into a bruised purple. Maya hesitated at the forest's edge, her fingers trembling as she reread the message from Elena. "It is me. I am sorry. Please meet me by the old oak. I need to explain everything." It was that plea for an apology that drew Maya into the gloom. Branches snapped underfoot as the air grew increasingly cold. She reached the clearing where the ancient oak stood, its blackened trunk arching overhead like a crooked limb. "Elena?" she called softly. Silence followed, then the unmistakable sound of a footstep. Before she could react, a hand gripped her wrist, and another shoved her shoulder. Owen stepped forward with a smirk, followed by Troy, who was slowly cracking his knuckles. Finally, Blake emerged with the leisurely confidence of a predator. "Where is Elena?" Maya gasped. Blake dangled her phone between 2 fingers. You mean the Elena who definitely did not text you? He sneered. Thanks for coming, though. It saves us a trip. Panic surged as Maya stumbled back. Why are you doing this? Because this is Jefferson High, Blake hissed, his voice dripping with venom. And you do not belong here. Owen and Troy pinned her against the oak as Blake produced a length of frayed, heavy rope. Despite her struggles, the cord was tightened around her wrists, the rough fibers biting into her skin. Blake looped the rope over a high branch and pulled upward. Maya felt her feet leave the ground for a terrifying second, a cry of pure dread escaping her throat. Now you are starting to understand, Blake grinned. Our school, our rules. Hidden behind a cluster of trees, Elena Thompson watched through her phone's lens. Her hands shook violently, but she did not stop recording. She captured the rope, the malice in Blake's eyes, and the systemic cruelty of the B Squad. When they finally lowered Maya and disappeared into the twilight, Elena remained in the shadows, clutching the only truth the school had refused to see. The clearing fell into a hollow silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of the abandoned rope against the tree trunk. Maya lay motionless on the damp earth. Elena scrambled down the slope, her voice cracking as she reached the girl's side. Maya, can you hear me? There was no answer, only shallow, erratic breathing. Just as panic began to take hold, a twig snapped. Elena spun around to see Jalen Brooks standing there, his eyes wide with horror as he took in the scene. Blake did this, Jalen stated flatly. He knelt beside Maya, his expression darkening with a memory of his own. They did something similar to me once. I tried to report it, but nobody believed me. They said I was exaggerating. Elena wiped her eyes, showing him the glowing screen of her phone. We have proof. I recorded everything. Jalen's gaze shifted from the phone to Maya. Good. Then, it is finally over for them. But first, we must get her out of here. With a pocket knife, he carefully severed the binds. He lifted Maya with surprising tenderness, shielding her from the cold. Jalen, Elena whispered as they hurried through the trees. Why are you helping us? He did not look back. Because, he replied quietly. When they did this to me, nobody came. Jefferson County Hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and sterile smells, but room 214 remained unnervingly quiet. Maya lay unconscious, her bandaged wrists a stark contrast to the hospital sheets. Elena sat huddled in the corner while Jalen stood vigil by the window. The silence was shattered by the arrival of Marcus Carter. He walked down the corridor with a gravity that made the hospital staff pause. He was a man carved from stone, his eyes holding back a tidal wave of fury. He ignored the police officer at the door and moved straight to his daughter's side. "Who did this to my little girl?" he whispered. The softness of his voice was far more terrifying than any shout. A doctor entered the room, but he stopped abruptly as he recognized the man. "I know you," the doctor breathed. "You are the Black Hammer, Marcus Carter, the world-ranked boxer." The room fell into a stunned silence. Elena handed Marcus her phone. He watched the video of the ambush in total stillness, his knuckles whitening as his fists slowly closed around the device. "The authorities will take it from here." "Mr. Carter," the doctor offered cautiously. Marcus turned his head, the fire in his eyes unmistakable. "No," he replied, "I shall take it from here." Rain pattered against the metal roof of the parking garage as Marcus stood by his sedan, his shoulders taut. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of wet concrete. Elena and Jalen watched from a distance as Marcus finished watching the recording for the third time. Suddenly, he slammed his fist onto the bonnet of his car. The metal buckled as if it were mere parchment. Elena jumped back, her voice trembling with guilt. "I am so sorry. I should have stopped them." "You did more than anyone else," Marcus rumbled, his voice lethal in its certainty. "You brought me the truth." Jalen stepped forward, revealing a faint scar on his forearm. "They did this to me last year. The school covered it up." Marcus nodded slowly. "They will believe it now. I am returning to that school, and I am bringing this video with me." As thunder rumbled in the distance, Marcus opened the car door. He looked at the two teenagers, who had stood by his daughter when no one else would. "Get in the car," he commanded. "You are both part of this now. You shall see what happens when the truth is delivered to the right hands." The engine roared to life, and the car pulled out into the storm. A reckoning was coming to Jefferson High. The grand entrance of Jefferson High had long been a symbol of order and prestige, but that morning the heavy glass doors were flung open with a force that seemed to challenge the very foundation of the institution. Marcus Carter stepped through the threshold, his presence as undeniable as a gathering storm. His jacket was still slick with the nocturnal rain, and his hands were curled into fists that looked as though they had been forged from iron. He did not look left or right. His gaze was fixed solely on the administrative wing. Students, normally boisterous and unruly, fell into a petrified silence as he passed. There was a primal energy radiating from him, the kind of silent, controlled fury that made the air feel heavy and hard to breathe. By the time Marcus reached the principal's office, the hallway was deserted, the students having retreated as if a predator had entered their territory. He did not bother with the secretary's protests. He did not knock. He simply pushed the door open, the wood striking the interior wall with a violent crack that echoed like a pistol shot. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling. Principal Grant sat behind his mahogany desk, looking every bit the bureaucrat in his crisp, starched suit. Assistant Principal Walker stood beside the window, his arms folded in a defensive posture, while two school solicitors hovered near the bookshelves, clutching leather-bound folders. And then there was Blake Henderson. He was reclined in a leather armchair, one leg crossed over the other, his hands tucked behind his head. A faint, insolent smirk played on his lips, the look of a boy who believed his family's wealth acted as an impenetrable shield. Marcus walked into the center of the room and placed a mobile phone on the desk. He did not set it down. He slammed it. The sound made Grant jump. "Mr. Carter," Grant began, his voice thin and strained, "I appreciate that you are distressed, but we must maintain a level of decorum." "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "You do not understand a single thing, not yet." Walker stepped forward, attempting to project a facade of calm authority. "We can discuss this rationally. Marcus, there are protocols for." Marcus's eyes snapped toward him, sharp as a razor. You knew my daughter was being tormented. You knew your celebrated athletes were the architects of her misery. And yet, after she came to you, practically begging for protection, you shook that boy's hand." Grant stiffened, his face reddening. "These are exceptionally serious accusations, Mr. Carter. Without evidence, they are merely—" "Evidence?" Marcus tapped the phone screen. "Play it." The solicitors exchanged a frantic glance. Grant hesitantly pressed the play button. The silence in the room was replaced by the visceral sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, and then Maya's voice trembling, pleading. The video captured the moment the rope appeared, the callous laughter of Owen and Troy, and the terrifying sight of Maya being hoisted into the air. The audio was hauntingly clear, echoing off the office walls like a recording from a torture chamber. As the video concluded, the silence that followed was even more suffocating. Grant's face had drained of all color. Walker's hands were visibly shaking as he gripped the edge of the desk. One of the solicitors whispered, "This is catastrophic." Blake, however, merely shrugged. He had not lost his bravado. "That video proves nothing," he drawled. "It was a prank. She was fine. Nobody actually hurt her." Marcus turned with agonizing slowness to face the boy. He did not shout. He did not lunge. He simply looked at Blake with a gaze that could wither stone. "Stand up," he commanded. Blake snorted, though his eyes darted toward the door. "Or what? You going to hit me, hammer? My dad will have you in a cell before the sun sets." "You are not worth a closed fist," Marcus replied, his voice deadly calm. Blake rolled his eyes and stood anyway, stretching his arms to maintain the illusion of indifference. Walker rushed between them, his voice rising in panic. "Mr. Carter, I must insist. Violence will not be tolerated on these premises. Marcus did not touch the boy. He did not need to. He took a single step past Blake, drew back his right arm with the precision of a world champion, and punched straight through the wooden bulletin board on the wall behind Blake's head. The sound was deafening, the splintering of solid wood and the thud of a fist hitting the masonry behind it. Shards of timber rained down onto Blake's shoulders. The boy stumbled forward, his smirk evaporating instantly, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked up at Marcus, his bravado replaced by a primal, naked terror. Marcus leaned in, his face inches from Blake's. "That is the fundamental difference between a man like me and a boy like you," he whispered. "I am fully aware of what I am capable of, and I know exactly when not to do it. You, however, have no idea what you have just unleashed." Blake was trembling so violently his teeth chattered. Principal Grant swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Carter, we shall commence a full internal investigation immediately." "You are finished opening investigations," Marcus said, withdrawing his hand from the shattered wall. "I am taking this to the highest authorities. This school is no longer in charge of the narrative." As Marcus turned to leave, every mobile phone in the room buzzed simultaneously. It was a synchronized chorus of notifications. Walker glanced at his screen, and his face went completely white. "It is online," Walker whispered, his voice cracking. "The video. It has gone viral. Millions have already seen it." Marcus did not look back. When that punch hit the board, every lie protecting Jefferson High began to crumble. The storm had not just arrived, it had broken the gates down. By sunrise, the prestigious grounds of Jefferson High no longer resembled an elite educational institution. It had been transformed into a high-stakes crime scene enveloped by a media circus. The surrounding streets were choked with police cruisers, their blue and red lights pulsing against the morning mist. News vans sat bumper to bumper, their satellite dishes extended toward the sky like metallic sunflowers seeking the light of a scandal. Reporters from every major network swarmed the entrance, their voices a discordant cacophony as they jostled for the best vantage point. The viral video had detonated the previous night like a digital landmine. Within hours, the footage of Maya Carter suspended from the oak tree had crossed international borders. The public outcry was instantaneous and ferocious. Hashtags like Number Justice for Maya and Number the Black Hammer had reached the top of every social media trend. The world was no longer just watching, it was demanding a reckoning. As the morning bell rang, a sound that now seemed hollow and irrelevant, students arrived in tight clusters. The usual laughter and banter were absent, replaced by urgent whispers and wide-eyed stares. The teachers stood near the main doors, looking frail and overwhelmed, their authority having evaporated the moment the video went live. "I cannot believe they actually did it," one student whispered, clutching her bag. "I saw the rope. It looked so real." "It was real." "Blake is finished," another replied, his voice low. "Did you see the news? His father is already trying to issue a statement, but nobody is listening." Inside the courtyard, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Blake Henderson attempted to arrive unnoticed, his designer hoodie pulled low over his face, his shoulders hunched. He tried to navigate the crowd like a ghost, but his infamy had preceded him. "That is him!" a girl shrieked, pointing a finger. Instantly, hundreds of phones were hoisted into the air. The very tool Blake had used to humiliate Maya was now turned against him. "Look up, Blake. Give us a smile for the live stream. Where are your friends now, you coward? The orange jackets are looking a bit pale today, aren't they?" Blake's composure shattered. He began to run, shoving his way through the crowd toward the gymnasium, but the mob of students followed him, their jeers growing louder. He stumbled against a row of lockers, the metallic bang echoing through the hall. He looked up, and for the first time in his life, he saw himself as others saw him. Not a king, but a parasite. The reporters outside had noticed the commotion. They surged past the school gates, ignoring the pleas of the security guards. "Blake, did you intend to kill her? Is it true your father paid the school to keep quiet? Do you have anything to say to the Carter family?" Blake was trapped between the students and the cameras. He lashed out, swinging his arm wildly. "Get those cameras away from me! Get out of my face!" But his voice lacked its usual bite. It was the high-pitched wail of a child who had finally been caught. The scene descended into chaos. A teacher tried to intervene, but the momentum of the crowd was too great. Suddenly, the piercing blast of a police siren silenced the courtyard. Two officers, their faces set in grim masks of duty, marched through the throng. They did not ask for permission. They did not negotiate. "Blake Henderson," the lead officer said, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "you are being taken into custody. There is a warrant for your arrest on charges of felony assault, racial intimidation, and hate crimes." The silence that followed was profound. Blake froze, his hands trembling as they were pulled behind his back. The cold click of the handcuffs was the only sound in the courtyard. "No, wait, you don't understand," Blake stammered, his eyes darting frantically. "It was just a joke. We were just messing around." The officer did not respond. He simply tightened the grip on Blake's arm and began to lead him away. As they walked toward the patrol car, a new sound began to rise from the students. It started as a murmur in the back and grew into a thunderous roar. "Justice for Maya! Justice for Maya!" Owen and Troy were apprehended moments later near the car park. They were dragged toward the cruisers as reporters circled like vultures over a fresh kill. The Golden Boys of Jefferson High were being hauled away in steel restraints, and for the first time in the school's history, the hierarchy of power had been completely inverted. The system had failed to protect Maya, but the truth had ensured that her tormentors had nowhere left to hide. As the cruisers pulled away, Marcus Carter was seen standing at the edge of the campus, his arms crossed, watching the departure with a grim, unwavering satisfaction. Part 12. The arrest of the B Squad and the fall of the complicit. The corridors of Jefferson High had never witnessed such a dramatic shift in power. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and collective shock. Students stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a living wall of witnesses that stretched from the main entrance to the administrative offices. The usual hierarchy of the school had been dismantled in a single morning. The arrival of a second team of police officers, their boots echoing with a rhythmic, military precision, signaled the next phase of the purge. Principal Grant followed behind them, his face a mask of sweating desperation. He looked like a man watching his life's work burn to the ground, unable to find an extinguisher. Blake Henderson was led through the hallway first. He was cuffed, his head bowed, the arrogance that had once defined him having been replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. The students watched him pass in a silence that was more damning than any shout. "Look at him now," someone whispered. "Not so tough without a rope in his hand, is he?" Owen and Troy followed, their faces etched with different versions of the same terror. Owen was defiant, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. Troy, however, looked physically ill, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. He looked like a boy who had finally realized that his actions had permanent, life-altering consequences. As the trio was led toward the exit, a girl in the front row, someone who had previously stayed silent out of fear, stepped forward. "Justice for Maya," she cried out. The response was instantaneous. The chant took hold, vibrating through the lockers and the ceiling tiles. "Justice for Maya! Justice for Maya!" It was a rhythmic, pulsing sound that seemed to push the boys toward their fate. Blake's composure finally broke. He turned his head, his face contorted with rage and fear. "Shut up, all of you! You have no idea what actually happened. She's a liar!" But his words were swallowed by the sheer volume of the crowd. He was no longer the author of the story. He was merely a footnote in his own disgrace. However, the arrests did not stop with the students. A group of officers diverted toward the assistant principal's office. Walker was standing behind his desk, frantically stuffing papers into a briefcase. He looked up, his eyes bulging as the officers entered. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with forced indignation. "I am an administrator. I have done nothing but follow school policy." The lead officer, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, held up a tablet. We have obtained the digital forensics from the Henderson family's private server, Mr. Walker. We have the encrypted messages you sent to Blake Henderson regarding the suppression of the Carter incident. Walker's face turned a bruised shade of purple. Those are private communications. They have been taken out of context. The context is clear, the officer replied, reaching for her handcuffs. You are being charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit a hate crime, and falsifying school records. You have the right to remain silent. A collective gasp rippled through the students who had gathered at the door. They watched as the man who had dismissed Maya's pain as sensitivity was forced to his knees and restrained. His briefcase fell to the floor, spilling documents that no one would ever bother to file. "Principal Grant! Do something!" Walker shrieked as he was hoisted to his feet. "You authorized the budget for the legal team. You knew." Principal Grant looked away, his eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet. He offered no defense. He was a man who had built his career on the silence of victims, and now that silence had been replaced by a roar he could not ignore. As Walker was led past the students, the mockery was relentless. "How does it feel, Walker? Still think she was overreacting?" The untouchables of Jefferson High were being purged. The system that had been designed to protect the privileged at the expense of the vulnerable was being dismantled in front of the very children it had failed. Marcus Carter stood at the end of the hall, his presence a silent sentinel of justice. He did not need to say a word. The sight of the handcuffs was enough. The B-Squad was gone, and the man who had enabled them was headed for a cell. The auditorium of Jefferson High was a sea of humanity. Every seat was occupied, and students stood 3 deep along the walls. The air was heavy with anticipation and a strange, somber respect. Even the most cynical seniors were quiet. The stage was empty, save for a single wooden podium and a microphone that hummed with a low, expectant frequency. Maya Carter stood in the wings, her fingers laced together so tightly her knuckles were white. She could feel the weight of the thousands of eyes waiting for her. Behind her, Marcus stood like a monolith of quiet support. He did not offer platitudes. He simply placed a massive, warm hand on her shoulder. The strength in that gesture was enough to steady her heart. "You do not have to do this, Maya," Marcus whispered. "The world already knows the truth." Maya looked at her reflection in a darkened monitor. She saw the bandages on her wrists, but she also saw a light in her eyes that had not been there a week ago. "I have to," she replied, "because if I don't speak, the silence wins, and I'm done being quiet." She stepped out from behind the curtain. The silence that greeted her was absolute. It was a silence of reverence, of guilt, and of profound attention. Maya walked to the center of the stage, her footsteps echoing like heartbeats. When she reached the podium, she had to adjust the microphone downward. The smallness of her stature only emphasized the enormity of her courage. Principal Grant stood at the back of the stage, looking like a ghost. He cleared his throat, his voice cracking. "Today, we listen. Maya, the floor is yours." Maya took a slow, deliberate breath. She looked out at the faces of people who had ignored her, people who had laughed at her, and people who had been too afraid to stand with her. "When I first arrived at Jefferson High," she began, her voice fragile but clear, "I thought I could be invisible. I thought that if I stayed quiet enough, I would be safe. I was wrong." She paused, and you could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. "I learned very quickly that silence in this school is a weapon. It's a weapon used by those in power to keep others down. It's a weapon used by students to avoid being the next target. And for a while, it worked. I felt myself disappearing. I felt like I was the problem." Her voice grew stronger, the fragility being replaced by a resonant iron. "But then, they took me into the woods. They used a rope to try and take my dignity. They wanted me to feel small, to feel like I didn't belong in my own skin. They wanted to see if I would break." She held up her bandaged wrist, the white gauze stark against the mahogany of the podium. "I didn't break, and the reason I'm standing here today isn't because of the police or the lawyers. It's because of the truth. It's because two people, Elena and Jalen, decided that they were tired of being quiet. She looked directly at Elena and Jalen in the front row. Elena was weeping openly, and Jalen was nodding, his jaw set in a hard line of solidarity. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Maya said, her voice now ringing through the rafters. "It's the decision that something else is more important than fear. Justice is more important. Our humanity is more important. And from this day forward, the silence at Jefferson High is over." The room seemed to inhale as one. A boy in the middle of the auditorium stood up. He was a member of the football team, someone who had always been part of the popular crowd. "Maya," he shouted, his voice thick with emotion, "I am sorry. I saw what they were doing, and I said nothing. I will never be quiet again." Then a girl stood. "I'm sorry too, Maya." Soon, the entire room was on its feet. It wasn't just applause. It was a collective confession. Students were crying, hugging each other, and shouting apologies toward the stage. It was a tidal wave of redirected energy. The fear that had ruled the school for decades was being washed away by a surge of empathy. Maya looked back at her father. Marcus was standing in the shadows, and for the first time, she saw a tear track down his cheek. He was not just the Black Hammer anymore. He was a father whose daughter had become a hero. Maya turned back to the crowd and leaned into the microphone. "Do not be sorry for what happened to me," she said softly. "Be brave for what happens next." The standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. Maya Carter had not just survived an assault, she had led a revolution of the spirit. The girl who was supposed to be a victim had become the most powerful person in the building. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a monolithic structure of gray granite and cold justice. Its steps were currently a battleground of flashbulbs and news microphones. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was heavy with the smell of old paper and the solemnity of the law. This was the final act of a drama that had captivated the nation. Maya sat at the prosecution table, flanked by her father and a team of state attorneys. She looked composed, her presence radiating a quiet, settled peace. Across the aisle sat the B Squad. The orange varsity jackets were gone, replaced by ill-fitting suits that made them look like children playing at being adults. Owen looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, his eyes fixed on the floor. Troy was visibly trembling. But Blake looked utterly destroyed. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of a boy who finally understood that his father's money could not buy his way out of a felony. The judge, a woman known for her uncompromising stance on civil rights, entered the room. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. The proceedings were meticulous. The court reviewed the medical reports, the psychological assessments of the trauma Maya had endured, and most importantly, the digital evidence. The video of the ambush was played one final time. Seeing it in the context of a court of law made it even more horrific. The cold-blooded nature of the planning, the racial slurs caught on the audio, and the sheer terror in Maya's eyes were undeniable. "This court has reached its verdict," the judge stated, her voice like a gavel strike. The actions of Blake Henderson, Owen Matthews, and Troy Collins were not pranks or youthful indiscretions. They were coordinated acts of racial intimidation and violent assault. They were designed to terrorize and to dehumanize. Blake's mother let out a strangled sob in the gallery. Blake himself just stared at the judge, his mouth slightly open. For the charges of felony assault and hate crime intimidation, the judge continued, "This court sentences the defendants to 3 years in a state youth correctional facility, followed by 5 years of intensive probation and mandatory community service within the communities they targeted. There will be no possibility of early release for good behavior. Your actions have demonstrated a fundamental lack of empathy that must be addressed through significant rehabilitation." The click of the handcuffs for the final time was a sound of absolute finality. As the boys were led toward the holding cells, Blake turned to look at his parents. He looked like a stranger to them. The untouchable prince of Jefferson High was being taken to a place where his name meant nothing. But the justice did not stop there. The judge turned her attention to the school board representatives, Furthermore, this court orders an immediate and independent audit of the Jefferson High administration. Assistant Principal Walker will face separate criminal proceedings for his role in the cover-up. Principal Grant, while not criminally charged at this time, is hereby barred from holding any administrative position in the state education system for a period of 10 years due to gross negligence. The courtroom erupted. It was a total victory, not just for Maya, but for every student who had ever been silenced by the system. As they walked out of the courthouse, Marcus Carter held the door for his daughter. The reporters swarmed them, but Marcus held up a hand. The crowd parted. "Mr. Carter, any words on the verdict?" "Maya, how do you feel?" Maya stopped on the top step. She looked out at the city, at the people, and at the sky. "Today isn't about the sentence," she said, her voice amplified by the silence of the crowd. "It's about the fact that no one is untouchable, and no one is invisible. We are finally seen." She took her father's hand and walked down the steps. The Black Hammer was no longer a name associated with violence, but with a father who had fought for the soul of his child. They walked toward their car, leaving the circus behind. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the air was finally clean. Spring arrived at Jefferson High with a gentle, transformative grace. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their petals drifting like pink snow across the courtyard, where, just months ago, a different kind of winter had reigned. The sun was warm, the air was sweet, and the school felt different. The heavy, oppressive tension had lifted, replaced by an atmosphere of cautious, earnest kindness. A new administrative team had been installed. The Orange Jackets had been banned, and in their place, a student-led council for equity and inclusion had been formed. But the most significant change wasn't the policies, it was the people. On the first Monday of April, Maya Carter stepped through the front gates. She wasn't hiding under a hoodie. She wasn't looking at the ground. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress, her curls free and vibrant, and her head was held high. Marcus walked beside her. He was no longer the imposing figure of vengeance. He looked like a man at peace. He carried her book bag, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched his daughter interact with the world she had reclaimed. As they reached the center of the courtyard, the student body began to gather. It wasn't a mob this time. It was a reception. Elena and Jalen were at the front of the crowd. Elena ran forward and enveloped Maya in a hug that nearly knocked them both over. "You look amazing," Elena whispered, pulling back to look at her friend. "I feel amazing," Maya replied, and for the first time, the smile reached her eyes and stayed there. Jalen approached, offering a quiet, respectful nod. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. The shared bond of their survival was written in their expressions. He had been given his old position back on the track team, and he was finally thriving. Then, something remarkable happened. A group of students, the same ones who had stood in the auditorium, began to line the path to the main building. They didn't cheer or shout. They simply stood in a silent, respectful guard of honor. As Maya walked through them, they offered small nods and smiles. It was a gesture of profound recognition. Maya stopped at the base of the stairs and turned to look back at the courtyard. She saw the oak tree in the distance, its branches now covered in new, green leaves. The rope was gone. The scars in the bark were healing. The woods were no longer a place of nightmares. They were just trees. Marcus stepped up beside her and handed her the book bag. "You ready, Maya?" "I've been ready for a long time, Dad," she said. She turned and walked into the school. This time, the silence that followed her wasn't cold or isolating. It was the silence of a new beginning. They tried to silence her by hanging her from a tree, but instead, they made the whole world listen. They tried to break her spirit, but they only forged it into something unbreakable. The boys who thought they owned the future learned that when you touch a fighter's child, you strike a blow against the very fabric of justice itself. And justice, as they found out, hits back much harder. So, as we close this chapter on Jefferson High, I have to ask you, which part of Maya's journey resonated with you the most? Was it the moment Marcus shattered the wall? or the moment Maya shattered the silence. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that one voice can change an entire system, then share it. Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because there are a lot of Mayas out there, and they all deserve to be heard.